Welcome to the final unit of the semester. Our first lecture is going to be on the cerebral cortex. I have chunked the information by dividing this into several parts, and essentially what I've done is divide it by the lobes. In addition, there'll be a couple of lectures, including this one, where I'm going to talk about some subcortical structures as well as the cortical. The cerebral cortex is found on the two cerebral hemispheres, the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. These hemispheres make up the majority of the human brain, if we're considering the brainstem and cerebellum and the cerebrum to all be the human brain. The primary neuron type is called a pyramidal cell. Some of you may have seen that in researching your diagnoses for your presentation. A pyramidal cell is a rather large cell, and it's got a large dendritic tree. So it's quite an extensive dendritic tree. You have seen the brains in the lab and have seen that they are not smooth, but instead have hills and valleys. Those hills or ridges are known as gyri. A single ridge would be a gyrus, like our precentral gyrus. The valleys are known as sulci. A single one would be a sulcus, or a fissure. There are a couple that can be called by either name, but most of them are referred to consistently as either a sulcus or a fissure. So please make sure that you're using the correct terminology. There are different neurons within the cerebrum, which are named by their starting point and their destination. If you have a neuron that is connecting a structure within a cerebral hemisphere to another structure within the same cerebral hemisphere, it is known as an association fiber. If you have a neuron that is connecting something in one hemisphere to a structure in the opposite hemisphere, that is known as a commissural fiber. Those neurons will travel through either the corpus callosum, or a small number of them will go through the anterior commissure. And then we have projection fibers, which are basically all the others. These include the tracts we have spoken about, both ascending and descending, and other tracts that we have not discussed that involve sending information from the cerebrum to more deep and inferiorly located structures, or vice versa. The corpus callosum is a band of axons connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres. It provides communication between them. It's important that the two hemispheres talk to each other. But people can get by if there is no corpus callosum. Rarely, infants have been born without a corpus callosum. And in other cases, the corpus callosum is severed surgically, typically due to epilepsy. The corpus callosum appears to be larger in women than in men relative to their brain size, but we don't know if this has any functional implication at all. Some will say that this allows women to be better at dual tasking because the two hemispheres can talk to each other more. Others say men are better able to have their hemispheres talk to each other. They're more efficient, so they don't need as many commissural fibers. The argument goes on, and I cannot tell you the answer, why women might have larger corpus callosum relative to their brain size than men. While there are many features that are shared between the two hemispheres, for instance, both hemispheres have a primary motor cortex, which is primarily responsible for voluntary motor control of the contralateral side of the body. There are some areas that are more emphasized in one hemisphere than the other. So the hemisphere is said to be dominant for these particular type of features. For example, the right hemisphere is dominant for spatial awareness and nonverbal communication, while your left hemisphere is more dominant for verbal communication, logical analysis and math, time awareness, and attention to fine detail. Here is a mid-sagittal section of a brain, and you can see the corpus callosum labeled with the blue dots. If you are looking at brain sections, such as on Digital Anatomist, to help prepare you for your lab exam, you may see the corpus callosum labeled more specifically with its individual parts. I am not going to test you on those individual parts. I simply want you to know the corpus callosum as a whole. I do, by the way, highly recommend that you look at those websites with actual brain sections to help prepare you for that lab exam that will be coming up your last weekend here on campus in May. You'll also find that in the lab you will be asked to identify the corpus callosum not just on a mid-sagittal section, but on other sections. Please refer to your lab list for which sections you are expected to be able to identify the corpus callosum on. This is an excellent YouTube video that I suggest that you watch, and in fact I suggest you stop the lecture and go to this video and take a look. It is a fascinating video of an individual who, because of intractable epilepsy, had the corpus callosum cut. So they went in surgically and cut the corpus callosum. So his right and left hemispheres can no longer communicate with each other. And it is just fascinating to see what he perceives and what he is able to do. Now that you've watched the video, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the different cerebral lobes. And in this part, we're going to focus on the frontal lobe. We have 4 cerebral lobes, and they're named for the bones under which they're situated: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. There's another area of the cortex, and I want you to keep in mind the cortex is just the first few millimeters of tissue on the surface of the brain. And within this gray matter, because the cortex is gray matter, you have a high concentration of cell bodies and dendrites. Situated deep to the lobes, and partly in the frontal lobe and partly in the parietal lobe, we have an area of cortex known as the insula. While it's on this slide, which is labeled cerebral lobes, the insula is not a lobe. It is a cortical region, not a lobe. So now let's talk about the frontal lobe and the structures within it. The frontal lobe sits anterior to the central sulcus. It contains several structures that we're going to talk about, and you can see them listed here, but we're going to go through them one by one. First, we'll talk about the precentral gyrus. You're very familiar with the precentral gyrus and the homunculus on it. So you know that the feet and lower legs are represented in the medially in the longitudinal fissure portion of the cortex, while the face is positioned and represented quite laterally. Next to the face, we have the upper extremity, with the trunk and the hip area tending to be kind of medial, right where you're coming out of the longitudinal fissure and just starting to come over the top. So we think of the lower extremities as represented medially and the upper extremities and face represented laterally. And this will become important when we talk about blood supply to these regions. The primary motor cortex contains the upper motor neuron cell bodies for those neurons that are in our corticospinal tracts, both anterior and lateral, and our cortical bulbar tracts. They are important for the execution of voluntary movement, and the lateral corticospinal tract in particular is important for fractionation. This is the sole tract that controls voluntary movement in the hands and in the foot and ankle, and it allows for individual movement and activation of those regions, and especially being important in the hand. It is what allows you to oppose your thumb to your individual fingers as opposed to having to make a fist. The somatotopic organization, again, is that homunculus. I've marked the precentral gyrus in red. So we can see the central sulcus immediately posterior to that. This precentral gyrus that we're looking at, the primary motor cortex on its surface, we would be looking at control of our face and upper extremity, and way at the top, we're probably getting up into the trunk region. If we look at a mid-sagittal view, so now we're medial, we're looking now more in the majority of the lower extremity and the foot. Note that the central sulcus is not the deep groove that goes all the way down, but is behind or posterior to those red dots, to the primary motor cortex, and only goes part way down. It's very hard on actual brains to identify the central sulcus from the medial aspect. So I will only ask you in lab to identify it from the lateral aspect. So what would we expect for symptoms if we had a lesion of a primary motor cortex? You should be thinking your lateral cortical spinal tract and your cortical bulbar tracts in particular, keeping in mind the anterior cortical spinal tract has some bilateral innervation, more to our trunk and shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle muscles, whereas our lateral cortical spinal tract is almost completely contralateral, and our cortical bulbar is contralateral, although many of the lower motor neurons and the cranial nerves receive innervation from both the right and the left cortical bulbar tracts. Because our lateral cortical spinal tract and an individual cortical bulbar tract goes contralaterally, that's where we would expect to see our symptoms. So we would expect a contralateral paresis or paralysis. And in the case of the lateral cortical spinal tract, we would be expecting to have loss of fractionation. If the injury were more lateral, we would expect this paresis and paralysis with the loss of the fractionation to be in the lower face, the contralateral tongue, and the upper extremity. If it were more medial that the damage occurred, we would expect it to be most pronounced in the lower extremity and foot. Additionally, the person may experience what's known as spastic dysarthria. This is due to some paresis of muscles involved with speech. Think about how important your tongue is in shaping the sounds that you make. And so if part of your tongue is paralyzed, it makes it difficult to make the sounds that you're trying to do. So we end up with a dysarthria, and in this case, it's a spastic dysarthria because we have an upper motor neuron injury. One thing I want to point out, and your book talked about this way back in Unit 2, is that when we have injuries up in the cerebrum, we are less likely to see hyperreflexia than if we have the injury in the brainstem or the spinal cord. And this is because the medial tracts, which mostly start in the brainstem, seem to be really critical in controlling reflexes. And those tracts are still working. They are fine when the injury is up in the cerebrum. As a result, we don't see the hyperreflexia as much as we do with an injury lower down, where those medial tracts as well as the lateral tracts have been damaged. That doesn't mean you won't see hyperreflexia, because we can't necessarily give good control to those medial tracts, because your cerebrum helps to control activity in those medial tracts. But so you may see hyperreflexia, but again, it's just a little bit less likely that you'll see it here than you would with an injury more inferior to the lateral cortical spinal tract. Directly in front of the primary motor cortex, we have the premotor cortex. Unlike the primary motor cortex, which is situated on a particular gyrus, the precentral gyrus, the premotor cortex spans across several different gyri. So you can think of it as more just this kind of area that sits in front of the primary motor cortex. Some of the anterior cortical spinal tracts start here because we need to initiate postural control before we move with our limbs. And the premotor cortex is activated before we have actual movement. The premotor cortex essentially gives direction to the primary motor cortex for voluntary movement. You can see here I've put some green dots down where I am representing my premotor cortex. If we have an injury to the premotor cortex, we're likely to have it in combination with the primary motor cortex. The way the blood supply is, an isolated injury to this area is unlikely. But if we do have an injury to this area, we will see impaired voluntary motor control. And in particular, we'll see a condition known as apraxia. I'm going to talk a bit more about apraxia when I talk about the supplementary motor area, which is just medial to the premotor cortex. But apraxia is essentially a problem with sequencing of movement. So the supplementary motor area is important with motor planning. It really is kind of an integration center for all of our sensations with our intentions. What do we want to do? What are our goals to achieve? Where are we? So it's looking at what we're going to see later in the parietal lobe, which is that spatial awareness, especially important in the right hemisphere. So where are we in space? Where are we relative to the object we want to touch or grasp or kick? So the SMA is an area that takes all of this sensory information, this perception of space and where we are in space, our intentions, what it is we want to do, and integrates all of this information. And that helps to instruct the premotor cortex, which then instructs the primary motor cortex. This SMA area seems particularly important for two-handed complex movements. So when you're doing something that involves both hands, I'm going to give an example of knitting that involves two hands, some complicated maneuvers that you need to do. The SMA is really, really important for being able to create those different movements when and how we need them. It's also a storage area for motor programming. We had storage of motor programs in our lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum. We have additional storage of motor programs here in the SMA. It is critical for the initiation of movement and again for movement sequencing. Here in the purple, we can see the supplementary motor area, or SMA. It is directly in front of the precentral gyrus, close to the longitudinal fissure, probably in the area around where the trunk and maybe the shoulder girdle and shoulder might be represented on the precentral gyrus, in that more medial realm. Looking at the medial view, a mid-sagittal view here, we can see how the supplementary motor area continues down on the cortex that extends into the longitudinal fissure. Again, it remains directly in front of the precentral gyrus and our primary motor cortex. Damage to the SMA will give us apraxia or dyspraxia. The difference is simply the degree, the magnitude. So apraxia, A means completely without. Dys means impaired. It could be too much or too little. In this case, we're talking about an impairment in motor planning. And so what happens is the individual may have normal strength and have intact sensation, and they know what it is that you are asking them to do, but they can't sequence the parts into a whole. So it may be that they are trying to make a sandwich, and they put the two pieces of bread together, and then they put the jelly on the top piece. So their sequence is out. Or it may be they're trying to get dressed, but they put their shoes on before they put their pants on. Or they don't recognize in trying to put on a shirt that they have to get their arm into the sleeve before they can bring the shirt around their back to insert the opposite arm. So it's a motor sequencing problem. So the cerebellum also had a motor sequencing, but that was more individual muscle contractions and joint movements. So when does a muscle turn on? When does a muscle turn off? At which joint? Which joints have to move before others? This is more bigger as far as like the parts of the tasks. So what do I have to do first? And then your cerebellum would determine what joints need to move and what muscles need to contract and relax in what order in order to achieve the sequence that the SMA has determined. If you have very large areas damaged, not just of the SMA, but of the sensory areas that connect to it, you may get something known as motor perseveration. And some of you may have seen this. This is where someone will repeat an action over and over and over, such as the person wants to lock their wheelchair, and they lock it, and then they unlock it, and then they lock it, and then they unlock it, and then they lock it, and then they unlock it. So perseveration means to, I don't want to say obsess, but it means to not be able to stop, to, whether you're perseverating by continually thinking about a particular thought and you just can't get it out of your head. When we talk about earworms with music, that's actually a form of perseveration. You just can't get that tune to go out of your brain. In this case, we're talking about a motor perseveration, where somebody has a motor task and they intend to do one thing, but they keep going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Here's a YouTube video that I suggest you take a look at that shows an older gentleman who has some apraxia. I believe he's putting a robe on, and he just can't figure out how to get his arm into the sleeve. And this little cartoon by Gary Larson, for those of you who are Far Side fans, would be something that might be needed for somebody who has apraxia but has that ability to understand what's required, that first you need to put your pants on before you put your shoes on. The next area I want to talk about is Broca's area. Broca's area sits immediately anterior to the premotor cortex and just superior to the lateral sulcus. It is an area where we store motor programs for speech and language. It is critical for the expression of speech. It's also critical for the expression of language, such as in the form of sign language. Broca's area is almost always located in the left hemisphere. In the vast majority of people, including left-handed individuals, the left hemisphere is the language dominant hemisphere. There will be a small amount of the population where that is not true. So again, in right-handed individuals, as you can see with some of the stats here, about 95% of the time their left hemisphere is their language dominant hemisphere. That makes up about 90% of the total population. In left-handed individuals, the left hemisphere is still most typically the dominant language hemisphere. But some left-handed individuals and some of those remaining right-handed individuals will have their language dominance be in the right hemisphere, or possibly split and have similar dominance in both, so they don't really have one hemisphere dominant over the other. But putting the whole population together, roughly 98% of individuals, their left hemisphere will be their language dominant hemisphere. So Broca's area will be situated in the dominant language hemisphere. In the non-dominant hemisphere for language, you will have an area analogous to Broca's or an area corresponding to Broca's. So it's not Broca's, but it would be the same spot. If you were to draw it on a brain, you would draw it in the same location. And it's going to have somewhat similar function. While Broca's area in the dominant hemisphere for language is important for the expression of speech, and not just speech, but other types of language such as sign language. The area analogous to Broca's in the non-dominant hemisphere for language, which again is almost always the right hemisphere, is important for the production of prosody. Prosody is tone and rhythm and the gestures that are used in speech. If you say the same word and you say it angrily, as opposed to saying it excitedly, saying the word is under control of Broca's area in the language dominant hemisphere, usually left. Giving it that tone of anger or that tone of excitement would be due to the area analogous to Broca's in the non-dominant right hemisphere. In the yellow dots, I have put down my Broca's area. We have our central sulcus. Immediately anterior to that is the precentral gyrus. On the surface is the primary motor cortex. Anterior to that, we have our premotor cortex. And now anterior to that, obviously quite lateral, we have the Broca's area, because this is a left view. If this were a right hemisphere, that same area that I've marked in yellow would be the area analogous to Broca's. If you have an injury to Broca's area, so we're talking about the dominant hemisphere for language, you will have what is known as a motor aphasia. This is also known as non-fluent aphasia, expressive aphasia, or Broca's aphasia. There are other types of expressive or non-fluent aphasias in addition to Broca's, but this is the one that I'm going to ask you to know. Broca's aphasia, or non-fluent aphasia, results in an impairment in speaking as well as writing and in sign language. The person is generally unable to produce a large number of words. In extreme cases, which are more infrequent than not, the person may only have one or two words. And sometimes that word or two might be a swear word. But I want to emphasize that that is not the common way that you're going to have with individuals with Broca's aphasia. Many of them will have a more extensive vocabulary, but it's going to be very broken up, frequently only includes nouns, so that other parts of speech are missing. They look like they're having trouble word finding, but it's more of a problem of knowing what they want to say, but not being able to make the motor plan to say it. So they can't get their mouth and tongue and structures to actually form the words. Generally, speech comprehension is good, and they can typically communicate by gestures and pantomime, because that's more of under the control of the opposite hemisphere in the area analogous to Broca's. But when you're thinking of a Broca's or a non-fluent aphasia, non-fluent is describing it. It sounds broken up. It's called telegraphic speech. because if you think of an old telegraph with it's very much like that. They'll have a lot of gaps, a lot of pauses in their speech. I've got a couple of YouTube videos here that you can take a look at to see individuals with varying degrees of Brokaw's aphasia. In at least one case, you're going to, I know I sit there and I watch it, and I almost want to give him the words. I want to, this is what you're trying to say. I know this is the word you want. So you have to be patient when you are working with clients that have Broca's aphasia, that you don't just jump in and supply the word for them. If the injury occurs in the non-language dominant hemisphere to the area analogous to Broca's, you will have what is known as a motor aprosodia. So again, prosody is tone and rhythm. So aprosodia would be absence of the prosody, and in this case, it's a motor issue. So the person cannot change their tone. They can't change their rhythm. They don't really alter their gesturing. So they sound very monotone. They may appear to be apathetic. There was a story of a teacher, I believe an elementary school teacher, who actually gave up teaching following an injury to this area because her students could never tell her mood from her tone. So if she was attempting to discipline and have the class, control, it sounded the same as if she was all excited and wanted the class to get all excited. And she couldn't really get across to the class her feelings and get them to be engaged appropriately. So she retired. So it can be very challenging from an occupation standpoint. The prefrontal cortex essentially is everything we haven't talked about in the frontal lobe. So it's everything in front of Broca's, the SMA, and the more medially located portion of the the premotor cortex. The prefrontal cortex is broken up into different parts. Mostly it's a location based. Keep in mind that during development, the cerebral hemispheres bent forward. The dorsal aspect is now the superior aspect. So the dorsal aspect is towards the ceiling versus in our trunk, it's behind us, it's our back. But in the brain, when we say dorsal, we're actually talking about the most superior part of the brain. Ventral is the inferior part now. So if we're looking on the underside, we're looking ventrally. Rostral is more anterior and caudal is more posterior, although I don't see rostral and caudal used in the cerebrum like I see it used in the brainstem and spinal cord. And then, of course, we have lateral and medial. So medial being in the longitudinal fissure, and when you first kind of come out of the fissure, and then everything else lateral. So if you were looking at a brain and you were holding it up and looking at it from the outside, what you're able to see there is the lateral. So our prefrontal cortex is divided into a medial dorsal prefrontal cortex. So that's telling us, okay, we're going to be in the longitudinal fissure and maybe just coming out of it. And it's going to be near the top. That makes sense if I'm coming up and out of the longitudinal fissure. Also known as the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. You may see the words either way. The lateral prefrontal cortex, sometimes known as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The ventral prefrontal cortex, so this is more the underside, but it's also, if we're looking at the brain from a lateral view, it's kind of the part that sits in front of the temporal lobe. So it's the more inferior portion. It's not just you have to tip the brain upside down to see it. You can see some of it from the lateral view. And there's an area within the ventral prefrontal cortex that's indented. It looks kind of like a thumbprint, and that sits right over your eyes. That's where your eyes are. And that's called the orbital frontal cortex because it's overlying the orbits or the eye sockets. That ventral prefrontal cortex, we're going to find out, is rather important in limbic system, very important with our emotions, affective. And it directly communicates with a structure we're going to talk about later in the temporal lobe known as the amygdala, which is very responsive under situations of high emotion, particularly fear. In general, with the prefrontal cortex, if you're thinking more lateral, you want to think executive function. Executive function is things like goal setting and organization, as well as divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is being able to take something and think of all the different possibilities. So if I give you a stick, what are all the different things you can do with that stick? You're getting your MOT degree. What are all the different things you could do with your MOT degree? That's divergent thinking. And that is opposed to convergent thinking, where I've got all these different things. Which one do I choose? So somebody has given me the options, and I choose one of those. So that's kind of the difference between convergent and divergent. So our lateral portion of our prefrontal cortex deals a lot with executive functions, being able to set goals, being able to organize, and this ability to think of all the different possibilities. And then you can see here all kinds of different things that are included under this region of executive function. Being self-aware, again, setting goals and having goal-oriented behaviors, planning and decision-making, time management and organization, rational thoughts and judgments and self-reflection. Where am I in towards achieving my goals? What can I do to improve my goal achievement? How could I have done that better? What did I do well? And I'm really good at that. All of that kind of stuff is here. There are several different areas of the brain, but this is one involved with attention and focus. This is also a very important area for our working memory. And in the last lecture of this unit, we're going to talk about memory. And then multitasking in the big picture, that's that divergent thinking kind of thing. More ventrally and medially, we want to think more about rudimentary behaviors. Delaying of gratification, control of impulses, foresight and anticipation so that you maintain motivation and persistence. Rudimentary reflexes are in this area, such as grasping and rooting, and this area helps to inhibit those rudimentary reflexes. When you were a baby, they were important for survival. You needed to be able to grasp, to hold on to your mother. And if when your mother's breast was placed near your face, you needed to be able to turn your mouth towards the breast. So the rooting response. But as we get older, of course, we are able to inhibit those rudimentary reflexes and behaviors. This is a big area with personality, and as I said, emotion, limbic. And then giving emotional meaning to different things that we experience. It's also important, especially in the medial area, for the perception of others' emotions and implying the intentions of others. So here you can see a lateral view of the brain, and I've kind of divided up the prefrontal cortex into medial, dorsal, ventral, including the OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, and the lateral or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So the darker blue at the top, That would be our dorsal medial or medial dorsal prefrontal cortex. In the red is the lateral dorsal or dorsal lateral. And then in the lighter blue, we have the ventral prefrontal cortex along with the orbital frontal cortex. Here on the medial side, because we're now truly medial, there will be no lateral or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we can see the ventral prefrontal cortex, again in the lighter blue, along with the medial dorsal prefrontal cortex in the dark blue. So that's going to be sitting right in front of our SMA, in front of our supplementary motor area, and pretty much all of that medial cortex in front of that. What it doesn't include, and so far we haven't included in any of our dots, is an area of cortex that sits right on top of the corpus callosum. And I'll be talking about that area in one of the future parts. So what happens if we have injuries to these areas? Or if we're talking about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so that area that's really important in executive function, we're going to have impairments in executive function, and we're going to have loss of divergent thinking. The person tends to show a more passive type of behavior because they really don't know, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know, I can't imagine all the different possibilities of what I can do. I have a hard time making a decision. Behaviors tend to be more rigid and inflexible, and they're very indecisive, and their working memory is impaired. So they might look up a phone number and then forget it before they can finish dialing. Injuries more to the ventral and medial prefrontal cortex lead to problems with impulse control. We start to see those rudimentary reflexes reappearing. We can't inhibit them anymore. Personality changes. We see a lot of changes in behaviors. And so I like to think of this area as the crude, rude, and lewd area when there's an injury. So people will often display antisocial or socially inappropriate behaviors or risky behaviors. They can be quite distractible. They have very poor decision making. It's not really that they're indecisive, but they no longer have kind of a gut instinct, or they don't respond to that gut instinct. So they make poor decisions. So they make decisions, whereas the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, they just can't make a decision. Here, they make a decision, but it's oftentimes not a good decision. They might misinterpret others' emotions or their intentions. They can be apathetic. And again, we see those reflexes coming back. And a couple of these, you'll see I gave you specific regions. I'm not going to ask you to know the regions. Just know we're talking more the ventral medial part of the prefrontal cortex. These are the things you want to kind of think about. A very famous case is the case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a gentleman who was working on a railroad, and he was pounding in a metal spike. I know that he was using some type of explosive powder, and it exploded on him prematurely and blew this metal pipe up through his skull. It went through, I think it was just under his left eye, if I remember correctly, and up through the top of his head. And so it took out his ventral and medial prefrontal cortex on the left side. It may have taken part of it out on the right side as well. If you look him up on Google, you'll find plenty of references to Phineas Gage. He was one of the first cases where we could see a relation between specific damage on an area of the brain and the resulting symptoms. Prior to the accident, he was very well respected. He had a family. He held this full-time job. I think he was even maybe in a supervisory position in his job. Afterwards, he had trouble keeping friends and family, lost his job because he demonstrated these crude, rude, lewd kinds of behaviors. There was a case that I heard about in a course that I took of a pastor who had a stroke in this area. And he ended up having to be removed from his position because he was telling dirty jokes in the pulpit. Again, loss of this inhibition, or I should say, loss of the ability to control impulses, and this change to inappropriate behaviors. That's kind of very common. Returning of some of those basic reflexes. So when you see things like that, you're thinking this part of the prefrontal cortex.